around the year 46 AD. And he, after he was converted, just joined St. Paul on his mission. Okay, so St. Paul's mission, a huge part of his work was dealing with Gentiles and things like that. So he had a Gentile with him, or half Jew, half Gentile with him. So Timothy was half Jew, half Gentile. His father was a Gentile. His mother was a Jew. And so by the Jewish law, because he was the son of a Jewish lady, he was considered to be Jewish, because they did it in kind of reverse order in those days with the Jewish people. So if you're the son of someone who is a mother, so you follow your mother's religion in this case. So that's why he should have been circumcised. So even though St. Paul was very clear to push the agenda that circumcision is no longer necessary as part of being God's people, faith is what's necessary, not circumcision, he had St. Timothy circumcised in Acts chapter 16, because St. Timothy should have been circumcised. So that was after the big council of chapter 15, where it was ratified, the idea that you don't have to be circumcised it was ecumenically ratified. So the whole church, that was a rule, no longer needed to be applied. But he did it anyway in this case because St. Timothy was a Jew and he should have been circumcised from before, i.e. following his mother's religion. There is a question whether he was with St. Paul in his Roman imprisonment at the end of his life. That's a question mark. We don't know that for sure. At some stage during the missionary journeys, he was left in Ephesus to look after the church. And so this letter was written to him when he was in Ephesus looking after the church. So then St. Paul wrote to him to kind of instruct him on how to manage the situation there in Ephesus. Okay, so this book is about, we'll talk about a couple of themes, but basically giving him instruction on how to manage the church in Ephesus at this time. He was young at the time of the letter was written. We don't know exactly how old he was, somewhere in his 20s, 30s, okay? St. Paul said to him, don't let anyone despise how young you are, okay? So he was younger than a lot of the people around, basically. But we don't know how young. He's probably not a teenager, but he'd been in his 20s or 30s. It seems he may have been sickly or unwell in some way. We don't know how or in what capacity, but it seems like he was sickly. And that comes from this chapter. And that will come from the controversial, or I don't know, for some of you, the exciting verses about alcohol, and we'll talk about that, okay? But it seems that he had some ailment. Now we know that St. Paul had a physical ailment as well. So we know that St. Paul had some illness that he considered a thorn in the flesh, that he begged God to heal. And God said no. He said, my strength is made perfect in weakness, and he left him in his illness, whatever it was. Some people say, I've heard before the contemplation, that St. Paul's illness was a skin illness, and he used to use his handkerchief to deal with his sores. And that's why when Acts says that his handkerchiefs are the things that created healing, well, then we can understand when God would say to him, my strength is made perfect in weakness, because it's that weakness, that pus coming from your skin, which was the healing source in other people. That's a contemplation. We don't know that for sure. So perhaps Timothy, going along with St. Paul, was kind of following the same lead as St. Paul with his ailments. We don't know. This book is one of the disputed letters. So disputed meaning that, so there's 14 epistles classically or historically attributed to St. Paul in the Bible. Hebrews, by all modern scholars, they exclude it. But historically, it's always been there as part of the Pauline canon. So that leaves 13. Of the 13, some are disputed, some are not. Disputed meaning that people dispute whether St. Paul wrote it, or was it someone after him who called himself Paul. That's what disputed means. We will assume that St. Paul wrote it. Okay, you always find, especially in the church, when we commentate on these epistles, we will assume St. Pauline authorship. The reason why people dispute it is based on a few different things. They base it on the language. So let's compare it. They compare it in Greek to the other letters of St. Paul, and they say, well, there's some differences here which suggests someone else wrote it. There is, some people will say that because this First Timothy is about the structure of the church, and there's a very clear structure of the church, well, that suggests a later date than what would you'd expect this epistle to be written in. And it doesn't make sense, so therefore someone later must have written it. Other people argue against St. Paul writing it, saying that it doesn't match the biographical details that we know that we have in Acts about the missionary journeys of St. Paul, and this is slightly different. Now, when you read, for example, Father Tadros Malti, he kind of refutes every one of those points, and he has a very logical argument against each one of them. And we're not going to go into details, but I just wanted you to be aware that if you read any commentaries outside, like scholars on the First Epistle of Timothy, you'll find that it's one of the disputed books, and it has been for a very long time. But that doesn't mean St. Paul didn't write it, it's just disputed. Okay, and a lot of modern scholarship is going back to the traditional understanding that St. Paul wrote most of these books. Okay, but just so you can, just for your own interest. All right, the themes about in this book. The main theme is church structure and order. That's one of the main themes. So you'll find that as you went through each of these chapters, St. Paul had something to say about many different things about how the church should run. Who should teach, who shouldn't teach, how you deal with people, who does this, who does that, okay, and how they should do it. It's about the structure and order of the church, okay? And this chapter that we're going to read today is about that as well. So we're going to read that in a minute. There is also a theme throughout of being aware of false teachers. So be careful, there is false teachers there who are going to teach you the wrong thing, and there's going to be a practical consequence if you follow their teachings that run through the book. All right, now we can start reading. It's what you guys have been waiting for. All right, in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God. So I'll read, just because I've got the microphone. Do not rebuke an older man, but exhort him as a father, younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, younger women as sisters, with all purity. The third verse is also related, but we'll talk about the widows separately. So, again, in the church setting, but this is in all relationships, he comments on how to deal with one another. Okay? So young people, don't rebuke older people, and talk to him as if he's a father. I want you to notice something about the nature of these relationships we're supposed to be having. So St. Paul is commenting on your relationships, the way you're to deal with other people. Notice that if you are older than someone, how are you to treat them? If you are older than someone, how should you treat them? As a brother, not as a son. Whereas when you're younger and you deal with an older person, how should you treat them? As a brother? As a father. So you see that the bottom line of what he's saying is humility. That if I'm seemingly above someone, then I treat them as my equal. If I'm a boss, if I'm older than you, if I'm senior to you, then I treat you as my equal. If I am seemingly below a person in age or in status or whatever, then I deal with them as my father. So no matter what you are, you're dropping your level. You're going underneath for the other person. You're not trying to put yourself up at someone's level. That's not what we're meant to do as Christians. We're meant to drop. The whole bottom line of relationships is humility. That's the bottom line that St. Paul is giving there. So notice that the way he does that is that you drop your level, especially if you're above. A real sign of holiness is how I deal with the people below me, or at least seemingly below me. By the way, there's no one below anyone. But as a boss or a superior or a leader, how I deal with the people under me, that is a sign of my humility. I should always drop my level down. The other thing that he does is, and he says the same thing about women and like mother and sister, but he says, he adds in with all purity. He adds that line in because As humans, we have to interact with the opposite sex. But we often do it wrong. We often do it wrong. That we feel that we can be comfortable, we can be best friends, we can relate to each other in a certain way. And we lose our purity and we think it's okay. You have to be very careful of dealing with the opposite sex. You must be careful. And he's clear on that. He says, when you deal with them as mothers, as sisters, with all purity. Be careful the way you interact with people from the opposite gender. It's very important. The bottom line is be humble in your dealings with other people and be pure. And be pure. Okay? Very important. St. John Chrysostom comments on this idea of telling off an elder. Just so we can, this is basically to us as children of parents. Be careful the way you talk to your parents. Look what St. John Chrysostom says here. Okay? Rebuke is inherently wrong, especially if it is directed at an elder. This wrong is doubled 3 times. Doubled 3 times. So it's 6 times. Okay? If the rebuke is directed from a young man to an elder. So you know when we tell off our parents, and we're so cavalier about it, like they're in the wrong anyway, they're so annoying, these parents of ours, and how can they keep repeating themselves and whatever else reason we have to be rude to our parents. Understand what St. John Chrysostom is saying, that is against what, and it's not just my parents, it's elderly people. We treat them with respect. We treat them with respect. Anyone who's older than me, I should deal with them in respect. Traditional cultures understand that really well. Modern secular cultures don't really get that. As a young generation, if you work in the health field, for example, often we don't call patients by Mr. their last name. We just call them by their first name. They'll be 85 years old and we'll be 30 years old and we'll say, Stanley, come here, instead of Mr. Williams. And they'll come in and you know what they'll say? Doctor, sir, and they have respect. But the young generation doesn't. It's not proper. So St. Paul is saying respect the older, especially, of course, our parents. All right, and of course, and the same is in the church. Of course, the same is in the church. All right, the next part he goes into, and we're going to read a big slab now, is about this group of people, the widows. Okay, so there's a special group of people within the church that he calls here the widows, and we're going to, because he spends quite some time on them, so we'll contemplate a little bit about that. So from verse 3, honor widows who are really widows. But if any widow has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show piety at home and to repay their parents, for this is good and acceptable before God. Now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. And these things command, that they may be blameless. But if anyone who does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man, well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. But refuse the younger widows, for when they have begun to grow wanton against Christ, they desire to marry, having condemnation because they have cast off their first faith. And besides, they learn to be idle, wandering about from house to house, not only idle, but also gossips and busybodies, saying things which they ought not. Therefore I desire that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. For some have already turned aside after Satan. If any believing man or woman has widows, let them relieve them, and do not let the church be burdened, that it may relieve those who are really widows. Okay, so 13 verses there on this widow problem. A couple of things to understand about the widows. They are a fixed status within this church community. Okay, it's not a random group of people. These people have a very specific and well-known place in the church at that time. Okay, presumably there was a lot of widows at that time, because men died young. Okay, there wasn't a lot of healthcare that we have now. Wars and things, the men would go off and they'd die, and then these women would be left as widows. And so St. Paul distinguishes between widows that are just widows and widows that have a role in the church, okay, a specific role in the church. And the church would take these people, this group of people, and they would look after them financially. So they would pay for them and make sure they have house and food and whatever else they need, and they'd be cared for. And they then had a role in the church. Okay, so they had to, he says there, wash the feet of saints. So they had a pastoral role, and they had to be hospitable. They had to take care of the hospitality of the church. Okay, and so they were very well known, and they became a very holy function of the church, and they became a well-known function, and to the point where Polycarp, who was writing, in the very early church, said about them that they became God's altar, or the place of prayer. So they were a very well-known, very well-respected group within the church. They were very honored. St. John Chrysostom says this about them. He says, "How strange, how particular he is in defining who can be qualified as a widow. It is almost similar to the traits required in a bishop." Okay? So this group of widows, he's saying that there's a very specific criteria who can be a widow because their role is so honored in the church in those days. Okay? So that's why there's so much said about them. And so we're going to, as we go through those 13 verses, we'll just learn a few things. We'll try and take some practical lessons out of it as well. But that's some of the background there. Rule number 1, which when you read verse 3, honor widows who are really widows. He's saying, and in verse 4 and 8, he's saying to them, if anyone does not provide, especially those in his household, he's denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So he's saying you must look after those people whom God has given you to look after. If God has given you people to look after, you must look after them. In this case, he's talking about the elderly, the destitute, the lonely, the people who have no one to look after them. But in our case, what does that mean? As a church, yes, we have to care for. I remember I heard a sermon by Father Thomas Hopko, who said that a church is not a proper church if it's not sending out buses to pick up the elderly and bring them to the church, or going and visiting the elderly, because they can't do it themselves. So it wouldn't be a proper church. So the church does have a responsibility in that sense. However, there is a service we have to do which begins at home for us. And that's what St. Paul is saying there. I think I'll repeat it again later. Is that, I think that's there. That you're worse than an unbeliever if I don't serve my own home. If, for example, I serve at church, but I treat people at home horribly. I don't care for the needs of the people in my own home. But at church, I'm very nice, gentle, I care for people. Then he's saying you're worse than an unbeliever. It's very harsh commentary, but that's because it's not proper. And St. Paul repeats it 3 times. I think 3 times. He says, if you can look after your own widow, look after them. But if there's no one to look after them, the church will look after them. So it's not proper to just pass on my responsibility to the church as a son or a father or a brother or a sister. I just dump the problem on someone else. No. God has given you people to look after. You look after them. And it's a responsibility that you must do. Or otherwise, he says, worse than an unbeliever. So rule number 1 is service starts in your home with your own family. Of course, there's the local family, and there's the extended family, and then there's your friends, etc., workplace, blah, 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 and it extends out. But it's not proper that we don't look after those people whom God has given us to look after. Because God has created a mechanism for everyone to be looked after. The reason why some people are not is because the people who were meant to look after them didn't. Father Taras Malati says, he has comments on St. John Chrysostom. He says, St. John Chrysostom noticed that some believers look after the spiritual and bodily needs of others while ignoring their own family's needs. This shows that their motive to serve others does not stem out of love or kindness of heart, but out of the love of appearances. Understand what's being said there. That if I fall into this trap, where I look after the needs of the church, the needs of people outside, but I couldn't care less about the needs of the people around me directly, then that's because I care about the love of appearance. It's not genuine love to those people outside. I just like to look like I'm serving. If their service sprang from the depth of a loving heart, they would not have ignored the service of their immediate families, which is a service that no one else can see or praise or be thankful for. The most thankless job, by the way, you'll discover in your life is serving your own family. You do something for your kids, and then you know what they say to you? You never do anything for me. That's what they say. It's the most thankless job you'll ever do in your life. However, that's the first job you're meant to be doing. The job that is unseen in your home. It's unseen in your own home. And so it is a scathing commentary by St. Paul, but it is a very important one that we all understand. Rule number 2 is in verse 5. Now she who is really a widow and left alone trusts in God and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. But she who lives in pleasure is dead while she lives. Okay, so he's saying that there is a group of widows that have no one. Okay, they have no family, they have no money, they have nothing. Okay, that group, the church will look after. But what should they do? And you have to understand when he says this, he's commenting on a group of people that are facing a very bad situation. The situation is that in those days, if you're a widow at that age, if they have no one, it's either because their family died. Okay, so not just their husband, but their kids. Or their family hates them. Or their family is wicked. Or their family is ill. But there's something wrong. And then they have no money, so they've been left with nothing. So the church has to look after them. So their situation is very bad. And there's no social security in those days. There's nothing to, they're not going to do job seeker, job keeper because there's a pandemic. They're just going to die. Okay? So their situation is very bad. So St. Paul says there's a solution to your problem. That you would pray and supplicate God night and day. That you would pray and supplicate night and day. So the first solution to your problems is prayer. No matter what your problems are, your first solution to your problems is prayer. The problem in the next verse is that a lot of people resolve their problem with pleasure. So they're down, they're sad, so they'll drink alcohol, or they'll have a relationship that is not proper, or they'll gamble, or they'll use drugs, or they'll be angry. So there's a negative solution to every problem. But what he's saying here is that if you take that negative solution to your problem, you will decompensate. You know, we do it to compensate, but it actually decompensates. Okay? I'll try and explain what I mean by that. There's a condition in health, in the heart, called decompensating heart failure. So the heart fails. When the heart is trying to pump blood and it can't pump blood properly, the heart muscle gets bigger. You know, it's like working out. Okay, so the muscle gets bigger to pump more blood. And it works for a time. But as the heart muscle gets bigger and bigger and thicker, it starts to decompensate because it's too thick. Not enough blood can get into the chambers and it can't pump, and it becomes inefficient. And the heart fails. The heart stops working and it's called heart failure. Okay? That's the condition called heart failure. It's decompensation. So the heart has done the wrong thing to fix the problem. Humanity does the same thing. We decompensate. We chase something that's completely wrong. It gives us a temporary solution or temporary relief, like alcohol for depression, for example, or anxiety. You drink a little bit, it makes you feel relaxed. Therefore, you think, oh, that's great. But over time, the alcohol makes you more depressed. That wrong relationship I went to fill that void because I felt lonely or sad, or that relationship I went into eventually turns into guilt. I decompensate. It makes me I'm trapped by it. So what he's saying is, don't turn to pleasure, turn to prayer. There's a solution that works, use it. Don't use the solution that does not work, that decompensates, that causes you much more problems. That he says if you turn to pleasure, you are dead while you live. You are dead while you live. So that's rule number 2. Boys, shh. Rule number 3. Rule number 3. The church does have a role, and we talked about this already, that the church has to look after those people who have no one to look after them. Okay? So part of the role of the church is to push the people that don't look after their families to look after their families. That's what he says there. He says, if you can look after them, look after them. But part of it is to look after those who have no one. It's a very sad reality sometimes that people come to the church looking for help and we turn them back. For example, a youth who is lonely, and they come to a youth meeting and they're left lonely. That's part of the problem that St. Paul is talking about here. These are widows. They're lonely. They don't come to the church for no reason. They come to find companionship, to find love, and they get turned back worse than before. It's not proper that we do that as a church. But of course, once someone has been integrated into the life of the church, it's not just social work. We're not just looking after widows for the sake of looking after widows, to give them food and shelter. No, then they have a role in the church. So they come in and they build the church. And these widows became a very important role in the church, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And that's the role of the church. Rule number 4 is that if these widows, when they came to the church and then they're going to serve in the church, there is some criteria for them to be part of that service, to be part of that that group that the church will look after, and therefore they would serve. They have to have certain criteria. So St. Paul lays out some of these criteria. He says they can't. They have to be the widow of one husband. Okay, so they can't remarry. Okay, when he says there, the wife of one man, he means that they're not marrying again. They're not gonna marry again. They marry once only. So there's an element of consecration to it. When you serve God, there has to be some sort of giving up. Okay, so they give up the right to remarry. They have to have been successful. Okay, so when they come to serve God, they have to have brought up a good family. They're not escaping their family to come and serve God. You know, in the monasteries now, there's a criteria that you can't go to the monastery unless you're educated, that you've had a proper career, then you can come. You don't just come. Why? Because some people escape their bad, like they have a horrible life, they go to the monastery as an escape. No, that's not the proper way. The proper way is I'm doing it out of love for God. So you have to be successful. I'm not just escaping my life to serve God. They have to, of course, be stable. They have to be hardworking. Okay, he says there, and they have to have washed the feet of strangers. They have to relieve the afflicted. They have to be diligent. They followed every good work. They must have been hospitable. They must have been caring. These are some of the criteria required to serve God. You don't just serve God so easily like that. So he lays out a set of criteria. Then he says in verse 9 that there are some problem widows, some of the younger ones. Okay, they cause problems. He says they're wanton. He says, do not let the younger ones come in because they have too much time. They learn to be idle. They wander from house to house being busybodies and gossips, talking a lot, saying things which they shouldn't. And they're just after pleasure. And then eventually they get over God and they want to get remarried. They want to marry for pleasure. So he's warning against that. He's saying be careful of that because when you have too much free time, when you have too much money, so he says in verse 9, do not let the widows... Where did I get that from? can't remember why, but one of the commentators was that they were rich, they have money, and all these people were coming to them looking for their money. Okay, I don't know why I've written verse. Oh, it's Acts 2 verse 9, I think. This book. Okay, here we go. Sorry, I'm confusing myself. In like manner, so chapter 2 verse 9, in like manner also, that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing. So he's saying that these younger widows, they got money. And so people are chasing them for their money. And so that's part of their problem. And the other problem is they've got a lot of free time. They're idle. So they're gossiping, they're talking, they're chatting, they're causing problems. And they become the target of false teachers. So in chapter 6, verse 5, the useless wranglings of men of corrupt minds and destitute of the truth, who suppose that godliness is a means of gain. So they're trying to take the money off these widows. Okay? So there's a specific problem he's addressing, and therefore these young widows then take this message of these false teachers and they'll spread them out. So St. Paul is saying be careful of these younger widows. And he says it's better that they get married. So he excludes them completely. Now, may there be some good younger widows? Maybe. But he says because it's a repeated problem, younger ones we exclude. It's only the older ones we take into this specific service. Okay? It's not sexist. A lot of people look at this, I was reading some commentaries, they say, oh, look how sexist he's being, one of the younger widows, why can't they? He's not being sexist, he's simply saying that these younger ones, they often want to get married, they're not in that stable place of life, therefore, they're not going to be in this particular service in the church. It's very simple as that. They're not consecrated. The consecrated ones are the ones who are over 60. So he excludes them. And he says, be careful of having free time and money. And we're going to talk about that in a second. St. John Chrysostom also comments and says that they are targets. So a young woman who's lost her husband, has no one to look after her, is a target. So he says, moreover, a young widow is like a city that is not guarded and therefore is exposed to theft and plundering. Many around her watch her. There are those who wish to lay hands on her, money as well as those who wish to corrupt her chastity. So saying those who want to steal her money and those who want to take advantage of her sexually. So he says this group we can't look after in that way. Okay, so he excludes them. St. John Chrysostom makes a quick comment, and I really want you guys to pay attention to this one-liner that he drops, okay, about being idle. He says, idleness is the teacher of all sins. So St. John Chrysostom is saying that these ladies have too much time on their hands, and that's why they're getting themselves into problems. You as young people have way too much time on your hands. There's no one who has more freedom in terms of time than you guys. I know you guys may think you're busy, but you are not at all. And so don't be idle. Don't do nothing with your time. Don't just sit around. Be busy. Have hobbies. Take spiritual targets in your life. Take other types of goals in your life. Don't be doing nothing, because it is the mother or the teacher of all your sins. When you're just sitting around doing nothing. That's when you're going to get cranky with other people because you think about what they did to you. That's when you're going to be envious. That's when you're going to be impure. That's when you're going to be start dabbling in drugs and alcohol. It's because I've got too much time on my hands. Whereas when you're busy, you're goal-oriented, you don't go down that path. So be busy. Be busy. Find whatever you can in your life with positive things to be busy. St. John Chrysostom says, idleness is the teacher of all sins. So be careful of idleness. Rule number 6 is that these widows, who were widows, who had a horrible portion in life, had no one to look after them, became a huge blessing to the church. Became a huge blessing to the church. Anything negative in your life, when it's put in God's hands, it can become something very great for you. Anything negative in your life, when you put it in God's hands, becomes something very great for you. Okay? And they went from really being strugglers, from being the lowest of the low, to being the ones that people would go to for the intercessions, would honor them, would respect them, because they would serve the people. They would wash the feet of the saints. So use the bad circumstances in your own life for good. Turn it into something good, actively, because that's what God does. God is looking to turn bad things in your life to good. God does not promise nothing bad is going to happen. He does not promise you're not going to become a widow. That's not the reality. But He does promise that when you're a widow, I'll be with you. When you are struggling, I'll be with you. And I will turn it to you for good. I will turn it to you for good. So always turn everything bad in your life, use it as a chance. Try to see the good in it, no matter how bad it seems, how it could possibly be turned into something good. Because it always will. In God's hands, it always will. That's a rule. That's a fact. It's always the case. It's not 99% rule. It's a 100% rule. And it's repeated all throughout the Bible. So always remember to use it for good, to try and work with God to make it something good. Because He will turn it into something good. So have hope in that. Abuna Taros Malti says, in treating the problem of suffering in the life of people, Christ has not come to take away pain from us, but He has willingly accepted it instead of us on the cross, thus changing the concept and the course of suffering. Such a beautiful statement that he says there. He changes the concept and the course of suffering. Widows are no longer considered a devastated, broken-hearted class of people who draw the sympathy and pity of everyone. On the contrary, they occupy the third rank after the clergy and the chaste, and have their great work and mission in the church. This strengthens their spirit, and in general, the whole church benefits from their ministry. So everything in God's hands turns into good. Also, he's talking about the virgins. Yeah, he's talking about the virgins. Well, they're essentially, they were like a consecrated brotherhood and sisterhood. So there was a group of people that were dedicated in the church who were virgins. And St. Paul talks about them in another place. So he's saying that they have the ordained clergy, then you have the eunuchs for the sake of Christ, as another way of Jesus puts it, and then you have the widows. All right, now we'll move on to verse 17, 18. Hopefully we're not going to go for too much longer. Let the elders who rule well be counted worthy of double honor, especially those who labor in the word and doctrine. For the scripture says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain, and the laborer is worthy of his wages. So he says here that if there's an elder, so he's talking about the priests and bishops and the ordained clergy, if there's someone who in the church, and it might not be just the ordained clergy, but anyone who works in the church, he says, let them be worthy of honor. When he talks about honor in this case, he's talking specifically about money, that they get paid, that they be looked after financially. And the commentators all say, like the fathers, they're saying that that's so that, and he says, pay them double. So make sure they're comfortable. It's not just pay them, but pay them comfortably. And he says specifically, not because for their leisure or pleasure, but it's so that they don't have to worry about money, so they can concentrate on the work they need to be doing. So the example he uses from the Old Testament, he says, you shall not muzzle an ox while it treads out the grain. So it's treading out the grain. Don't close its mouth so it can't eat while it's doing the work. Okay? Let the thing eat so it can do good work. And then he says, he uses Christ and says the laborer is worthy of his wages. So don't, and so he uses both those examples. Now, and the church has always had that as a model. When the church ordains clergy, for example, it looks after them financially, it pays them. It doesn't make them chase their own money. Of course, there is the St. Paul talks about in another place where he didn't rely on the church. He relied on himself to fund himself so he wouldn't put a burden on the church. So there's two models. But he says very specific, and the church has always taken this as a model to look after the clergy in that way. But for a spiritual lesson to us, always remember this rule more generally, that you never withhold what's rightfully someone else's. If someone has done work for you, if someone is deserving of something, don't withhold it out of either stinginess or some sort of dispute, or be careful of that, because it's not proper. That I meant to be fair in my dealings. If someone is worthy of wages, I give them wages. If someone's worthy of thank you, I give them. I don't withhold it on principle or because I can't afford it, or I think I can't afford it, or it's too much. Always apply that rule. Be generous in that way. Don't withhold what should be given. Verse 19 to 21. So again, we're talking about the order of the church here. Do not receive an accusation against an elder except from 2 or 3 witnesses. Those who are sinning, rebuke in the presence of all, that the rest also may fear. I charge you before God and the Lord Jesus Christ and the elect angels that you observe these things without prejudice, doing nothing with partiality. So again, he reaffirms the Old Testament rule that you don't accept an accusation against anyone without 2 witnesses. Okay, so if someone comes and blames a bishop of doing the wrong thing, you don't accept that unless there's more than 1 witness. And the reason being is that the men of God, or the bishops especially, are the most prone to attack out of everyone in the church. And so they're most prone to people be unhappy and discontented. So we have to be careful that we listen to everything that we hear. We shouldn't. It needs investigation and witnesses, but not by us. Not by us. It's not for us to rebuke the men of God. If there's something, obviously there's mechanisms for it, and then it's up to the right people to investigate. And that's why he says here, Timothy, when you do investigate it, do it with partiality. Without prejudice, with partiality. So he's saying, be careful. It's a treacherous path to rebuke these men. So if you're going to do it, make sure you do it carefully. So he's saying, if they're found guilty, then expose them. Then you expose them. Of course, Timothy to expose them, he's the head of the church, not anyone. So be careful the way we deal with bishops and priests, and sometimes I think we're too entitled in the way we deal with them. We're saying, Paul is saying there's a mechanism. If they're not being honest, there's a mechanism. But it's up to the right people to do it without prejudice. Not just because I'm upset by something, because that's prejudice. There's something against me specifically. That's the people that attack the bishop. They're unhappy with something the bishop did, so they attack him, and that's their own prejudice. Maybe he's wrong, maybe not. But there's a mechanism for it. And that specific setting, then they can do it in a certain way, and those people have to be very careful the way they judge them. For example, St. Timothy has to be careful. So just be careful of all the things you hear, and don't buy into the negative culture that sometimes envelops within the church against the leaders of the church. Be careful of that. Then he talks in this last part about ordinations. Okay, so 22 to 25, and he does a little aside on alcohol, which I'll comment on as well. Ordinations, so do not lay hands. So laying hands means ordination. Okay? Do not lay hands on anyone hastily, nor share in other people's sins. Keep yourself pure. No longer drink only water. So he goes on this little aside, this one verse on alcohol. No longer drink only water, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake and your frequent infirmities. Some men's sins are clearly evident, preceding them to judgment, but those of some men follow later. Likewise, the good works of some are clearly evident, and those that are otherwise cannot be hidden. So verse 22 and 24 and 5 is about ordination, about choosing people that are going to serve God. And he says, don't be hasty, and needs a lot of thinking. And he says it's a big responsibility. Because if you ordain someone who's not correct for the service, then you are sharing in their sin, he says. Nor share in other people's sins. So if they make a sin, the person who ordained them, it's a big responsibility on the bishops. And the same way that they will share in their reward, you know. So he's talking about that there. And he's also saying that the people that serve God need to be tested by time. He says they need to be tested by, because some people's, in verse 24, some people's mistakes are very evident. So you're going to stay away from them. But other people, you can't see the mistakes right now, but they might turn up later. Other people, they look bad now, but actually very good. So they need a bit of time. So he's saying, take your time with that kind of thing. And the church has always followed this. They don't just ordain people. Someone's converted to the faith, they don't just ordain them on the spot. No, they give them a long period of time before they ordain them. They don't ordain people up to a certain age. Why? To give them time to see if they're able to serve God. And then we'll do this quick aside on alcohol. So he says, no longer drink only water, but use a little wine for your stomach's sake and your frequent infirmities. So Timothy was avoiding alcohol for the sake of asceticism. So he was trying to be ascetic, to stay away from alcohol. So St. Paul in his love said, look, there's a perceived benefit of alcohol on his ailments or his infirmities, frequent infirmities, he says, for your stomach. So he says drink a little alcohol. Okay? Drink a little alcohol. In those days, alcohol was diluted in water. So it's a very low alcohol percentage for a perceived medical benefit. Now, I challenge anyone to come up with a proper medical benefit that makes you can justify drinking the amount of alcohol that gets drunk in our world. It's just nonsense. I did do some research on the medical benefits of alcohol, and it's very limited to very, very small amounts of alcohol. Exactly what's written here, a little. It says you can have a little for the sake of your infirmities. Okay? The health benefits of alcohol, and I can talk through it with you if you like individually, but it's not a free pass. He doesn't forbid it. He says it in this case because of St. Timothy's health, but it does not give a free pass for alcohol. It's much better to stay away from alcohol because the disasters it has on mental health, on society, on you as individuals, the sin, the drunkenness, far outweighs any health benefits. There is very, very minor health benefits, which actually, one study I read said, actually, if you just exercise, it's better than drinking that small amount of alcohol each day. So, from a health perspective. So, we have to be very careful about alcohol. It is not a free pass. This verse is often used to give people a free pass in alcohol. There's like 2 or 3 verses in the Bible that people love to just throw around, ignoring all the rest of them. Be careful. He's not giving a free pass here. In his mind, there's a clear health benefit to Timothy for drinking a little bit of alcohol. By the way, there's some alcohol in some medicines. So in those specific cases, of course, but it's tiny amounts. It's not the way we drink recreationally. That's not what he's talking about here. So it cannot be extrapolated to the social settings that we give ourselves privilege in. So that's it. That's the Bible study. Glory be to God. If anyone has any questions or comments, please feel free to ask. I know it's been going for a long time. So. God bless you guys.